בוקר טוב, חודש טוב לכולם. Great. I want to give, what we were doing, we were discussing the machloket Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda, whether an individual or minority that is sinning based on Beit Din, whether they're exempt from individual chatas, despite the fact that there is no public bull brought because it was only a minority. So are they still exempt from private chatat as they base themselves on the ruling of Sanhedrin or not? And one of the sub-discussions of that machloket was how to define this person, whether we can define him as anus, consequently is patur from chatas, or is he still considered shogeg? Yeah, he made a mistake. He thought that it's mutter because Beit Din told him so. Okay? But it's a shogeg, it's not an anus. Yeah, that was our discussion last week. We started there. We have seen that it could be a machlokes between Tanaim, according to the way Tosfot explained the Gemarah in Masechet Shabbos. To the Tanaim, according to Tosfot, both Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda claim that he's exempt. That's according to Tosfot. But Rabbi Shimon says you don't need a pasuk for that. So it seems that he thought he's an anus. And Rabbi Yehuda thought that we need a pasuk for that. Probably it's because of special din in Horayos. That he is, since there is a potential that for a public bull, so even if there's not, he's already exempt from the category of individual chatas when there is a ruling, a public ruling of Beit Din. So, Boker Tov, Miki Chodesh Tov.
Boker Tov.
So we've seen now why we said even more than what we said now. We said, why should we define? We said let's analyze the concept of onus. So nerech minakal el hakaved. I remind you, there is an onus when someone is mamish, forced to do something physically. Someone is taking his hand and someone is throwing his body on another person, and that person is killed. That's the highest level of onus, or chas v'shalom, a lady that is raped. Then the I, the personality, is totally passive, and actually I can say that I don't attribute the action to the person at all, and therefore there was no ma'isa avera here from the point of that body. His body did an avera. The person didn't do any avera. Okay, so he's totally exempt. You'll definitely not have to bring anything. That's the highest level of onus. Then there is, of course, an onus, like I said, like Godfather. Someone gives a gun to your head and tells you either you sign that contract or not. Here, on the one hand, it's the person who did the action, as opposed to the previous case. So the action is connected to the personality, but the personality decided to do so totally under coercion, okay? So you could say it wasn't really a choice, and therefore here, people agree that that's also a category of onus that is exempt from any criminal responsibility. Now we're going to the third stage. The third level is what we read together in the Rambam, in Hilchos Shgagot. A person who slept with his wife had no reason to suspect that she is Anita, had no reason, and then it was found out afterwards, in retrospect, that she was Anita, but he had zero control over the reality circumstances, and also there was no negligence, meaning he did all the checks in terms of procedure that he should have done, okay? So here also the Rambam says he's an anus and not a shogeg, okay? Now we're coming, the fourth level is actually our case. On the one hand, this innocent Jew really, l'chora, couldn't have done anything better. In that sense, it's very similar to the Rambam's case. On the other hand, as we said, the mistake was done by Beit Din, that was the Sanhedrin that misled him, okay? And this is still a human being mistake. It's not like the Rambam's case, okay? It is a human being's mistake. of course, the agent himself wasn't his mistake. He was basing himself on another one's mistake. But at the end of the day, it's a mistake of human beings. So he was based on a mistake of human beings. So maybe he is not an Anus. Maybe he is a Shogeg. I'm not going into other alternative explanations saying that even a simple Jew still has some responsibility to inquire, even if it's Sanhedrin, but that will be controversial. But let's assume now that he doesn't have. All right. We said that the basis for that machloket tanaim of our case, whether it's an onus or a shogeg, we already alluded to the fact that it could be also, as people already said here a priori, and we'll now see it in the sources, as Baruch Hashem. Why is one bringing chatas on shogeg? If the chatas on shogeg has to do with atonement on some fault, then it seems plausible that this guy is exempt. After all, it wasn't his fault at all. He was basing himself on Sanhedrin. He couldn't have done better. So that gives a lot of force to the position of Rabbi Yehuda that this guy is defined Anus and not Shogeg. However, we can see Shogeg. And by the way, we're bringing Shogeg not on every Aveira that we're doing inadvertently. We're bringing Shogeg only on Aveiras that are very high level, kares. Only Aveiras that are kares, if you're doing them intentionally, then if it's in Shgaga, you bring the offering. So one can say that the offering doesn't have to do with fault. The offering has to do with the metaphysical dirt that is now stuck to you because you did a Maisa Aveira. Okay? So it's not that your fault. It's just a terrible action objectively. And therefore, if you did such a terrible action objectively, even though it was totally not in your responsibility, you have to bring atonement, shogeg. Now, why an anus, therefore, you're not bringing? Because in anus, we don't even connect the action to you, as I explained in the beginning, all right? But here, we can somehow connect it to you, and even though it's not your fault, you're bringing the chata. So that could be the basis for the machlokes. Now, if the machloket is indeed regarding the question of whether the case here is honest or not. So now I'll share a screen with you just to complete the topic. Here, everyone has the screen. Let's learn the Gemarah in Bava Kama. Matnitin neish barakado bereshut harabim. Okay, here we see a Gemarah in Bava Kama. There is a Mishnah. His jar was broken in the public domain. And then, huchlak echad b'mayim. And then someone, the jar was with water in the public domain. It fell off from his hand. And then a person came and slipped. Or he was cut by the cheres. Yeah, it was a cheres. How do you say cheres? Okay, the jar was broken. Ceramic. Ceramic, right, something like that. So the jar was broken, and then someone was damaged from that fact, okay? He is obligated to compensate him. Yeah, it's considered nizkei mamon, the damages of his property. It's his jar or his water. So he is chayev. It's like a bor b'reshut harabim, right? Seems. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, b'mitkaven chayav, be'ino mitkaven patur. Rabbi Yehuda limits. There is a machlokas here between Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda. Tana Kama seems to be, we'll see that there will be a modification here, but from the simple, straightforward reading of the Mishnah in Bava Kama, it seems that Tana Kama gives an absolute responsibility. Meaning, maybe I was walking in the Reshut Rabbim with my jar, and it slipped from my hand, and it wasn't negligence at all. It's something that can happen to any person. So that was not intentional. And then someone slipped. So it's not my fault. All right? So Rabbi Yehuda says, "B'mitkaven chayav," if the breaking of the jar was intentional, then he is responsible. It's connected to him. It's his action. Beino mitkaven patur. Rabbi Yehuda omer b'mitkaven chayav. Now the Gemara tries to explicate this. Eichidami mitkaven. What is Rabbi Yehuda really saying? What does he mean intentionally? Like breaking it intentionally? That doesn't seem the pshat. Amar Rava b'mitkaven lehorida lemata miktefo. Aha. So Rabbi Yehuda, it's not like I explained that he had intention to break the jar. That limits too much his responsibility. What he means to say, if the action was intentional, I mean, he wasn't intending to break the jar, but the movement that caused the jar to break was intentional, meaning he was taking the jar, trying to put it off him, and then it broke. So it was definitely an action of his that caused the jar to break. Here, Rabbi Yehuda is mechayev. But if not, if it just slipped, let's see, Amar le Abaye, Michlal. So I can conclude from here that Rabbi Meir, or Tanakama here, mechayev afilu nifshara. Yeah, if you are broadening the scope of the responsibility of Rabbi Yehuda, who made the distinction between kavana, and you say that you don't need a kavana to breaking, even a kavana just for the action of taking it off, that's already enough to make you responsible. So the Tana that said that he's chayav anyway, even if he wasn't intending, that means that he's mechayev even when it slipped off him. So Rabbi says, oh, you're saying a big chiddush, that there is a Tana here that says that one is chayev. If someone slipped on the water when your jar broke in Reshus Rabbim, so even if it just slipped from your hand with no negligence, you're chayev. Amar le in, you know what? You're right. Mechayev afilu azna biyado. Even if I hold the handle, Rabbi Meir says, even if the handle is in your hand, and somehow it melted and broke. If Shara, it melted and it fell down. Meaning it's a classic case of onus. All right? So Rabbi Meir even here says you're chayiv in the zikin. Now the Gemara challenges this. Amai anusu. Why? This is onus. He's not responsible. It's beyond his control. But onus rachmana patre, and we have a general rule in the Torah that in onus, yeah, you're pater, because it says velanara lo taseh davar. Yeah, that's a Torah in the next week's parsha kiteitzeh. That onus is pater from any criminal responsibility. So why should he be here chayiv? Now the Gemara offers an important distinction. Maybe you want to argue in order to defend Rabbi Meir's opinion that he's chayev even if the jar melted. This Torah of onus is written regarding a capital punishment. There we exempt the lady for being raped. Avalinyan nezikin, but regarding what?
Damages.
Damages. Monetary obligation for responsibility for damages, you'll be chayav even in onus. Maybe you want to offer such a distinction. We'll return to that offer. Ve'atanya, but we have a baraita, tonight's source, that totally contradicts it. Nishbara kadu v'lo silko. His jar was broken and he didn't remove the broken pieces. Nafal gmalo v'lo emido. His camel collapsed and he didn't he left it there, meaning he left damages scattered around. In Reshus Harabim, like broken pieces of a jar or a camel, Rabbi Meir mechayev be'ezikan. Rabbi Meir obligates, and Chachamim are saying he is exempt from Dinei Adam, from judgments of human beings here under the planet, but he is responsible morally, meaning he is responsible in Dinei Shamayim. And Chachamim concede to Rabbi Meir, Modim Chachamim LeRabbi Meir, Be'avno Sakinahu Masa'o, his stones, his knives, or his luggage that he placed at the top of the roof, Benichan Barosh Gago, and then Naflu Baruach Mitzuya Ve'iziku, and then a common expected wind, an expected wind, went there and threw away this knife of his or this stone of his and a damage. Uchayav, meaning the sages that said that if the jar broke and he didn't remove it, then he is exempt from Dinei Adam. They concede that he is chayev, he is responsible to compensate, to give monetary compensation. If you left it on the roof, knowing that there are winds there, and the winds threw it off. Here he is responsible. Umode Rabbi Meir LeRabbanan, and Rabbi Meir concedes to Rabbanan that he's exempt when he brings all kinds of jars, or all kinds of vessels to the roof in order to wipe them. He wants just the sun, and he wants to wipe them. That's why he's bringing them. And then they fell in a ruach she'eina metzuya. They fell in an unexpected. There was a strong wind that was not accepted and not a common wind at all. Ve'eziku, that shuhu patur, that he's exempt. So what do we see? We see that there is a difference here between the Hava Amina and the Maskana. Okay, the first attempt of that. At first thought, the Gemarah considered an option that Rabbi Meir is obligating absolutely, even in onus. Okay? That was the Hava Amina. The Hava Amina was that Rabbi Meir makes a distinction between capital punishment and Nezikin. There is no exemption of onus. Okay? That was the Hava Amina. The Maskana is not. The Maskana is that Rabbi Meir is actually concedes that on some extreme circumstances, like an unexpected wind, he is not responsible for monetary compensation. So how can we understand now the Hava Amina? Hava Amina could be a one of two. Rav Lichtenstein explains that the Hava Amina of the Gemarah, you could say that ones, a first attempt, which is rejected. I'm just saying, one would say literally, but the Hava Amina is that onus is a ptor only in very, very extreme cases like capital punishment. Meaning, let me explain. The Hava Amina, if you read it mamash literally, one can walk away from the Gemarah and say, no, any other averos, even onus, still, it's your body that did it. You're chayev. It's not a question of fault. Only in terms of executing you, here we have a ptor, an exemption of onus. Meaning, the assumption here is that tachlis, there is a ma'isa avera even in onus. Now that's a very, very extreme way to understand the Hava Amina, and no wonder why the Maskana of the Gemarah retracts from that. The other option is to say no. Already in the Hava Amina, in onus, it's clear that you're exempt from punishment. One cannot be punished, capital punishment, lashes, money, Whatever it is, one cannot be punished neither by giving him a fine, a monetary payment, or lashes. If your anus, coercion, or something beyond your control, if we're talking about this, let's say the the jar melted, you're exempt from punishment. You don't, what do you mean exempt? You don't have criminal responsibility. That's we learned from Onus. So when it says here, Hane Mila Linyan Katla, Katla is just the example of punishment. Yeah, but you're always, but what is the Hava Amina that you're still responsible to compensate? You will say that the payment of Nezikin is not a punishment, according to the Hava Amina. And that's why there is a Hava Amina that is chayav even in Anus, okay? Because the payment is not a matter of criminal responsibility. We're not talking about that. We're talking about compensation, whether you have responsibility to the implications, to the consequences of your action. Meaning, here we still see the consequences as you being responsible for them. Not criminal responsibility, but it's still attributed to you. And therefore, again, compensation of Nezikin is not a punishment. It's not a fine. So onus is only an exemption from punishing morally. Like you didn't have a freedom of choice, so therefore we're exempting you for punishing you. But here we're not punishing you when we're requiring you to compensate. Okay, that's very easy. So that was the Hava Amina, why onus is not applicable at all regarding the monetary compensation, the consequences of actions that were done by your body. What is then the maskana according to this? Why do we still apply the ptor of onus? Why do we still apply the onus even for Nezikin, let's say when there is an unexpected wind? So we could either say that no, the maskana understands that compensating in Nezikin is indeed considered a punishment conceptually. That's why you're exempt. Meaning we maintain our chiddush that consequences of the action of the person are not exempting, even if it's onus. Only punishments are exempt from onus. But the maskana thinks that tashlumei nezikin, payments of nezikin, is considered a punishment, just like talach. The other option is to say no. Onus means not only exemptions from criminal responsibility, from punishment. Onus means that you're not the agent that did the action. Okay? And since you're not the agent that did the action, this is not considered a consequence of your action. Therefore, it's an exemption not only from punishment, it's an exemption also from if things were beyond your control, then you're not responsible for the monetary consequences of it, even if we don't define it as a punishment. Now, of course, you understand that the difference between these two understandings of the conclusion of the Gemara, whether onus is merely an exemption from punishment or an exemption even from the consequences, could be at the core of the machlokas of the Tanaim here in our sugya. How do I see chatas? Do I see chatas as a punishment for pshia? Or do I see it not as a punishment? I see it as a consequence, like tashlumei nezikin, according to one understanding, meaning it's just an opportunity for one to have atonement. You did an action, it wasn't your fault, it was b'shogeg. So you don't have criminal responsibility. So the chatas is not a punishment. The chatas is just that in a beres of karet, there is a consequence of bringing a korban for atonement. So you see that will be here. If you say that chatas, so to say that chatas is a punishment, first of all, to say that chatas is a punishment Rav Lichtenstein claims that it's a very, very problematic claim. Okay? He says it because the Mishnah in Erchin says that one is not memashkenimoto. You don't take money like in order to force him to bring chatas, a mashkon. How do you say mashkon? There is a word for it. There is a word for mashkon. Here, I'll find out. 1 second. I'll find out in a second how do you say mashkon. In a second.
Pawn, isn't it?
What?
Pawn. P-A-W-N.
Miad. Yeah, it's a collateral. Collateral. Okay? Collateral. So the collateral, by the way, you all still have the screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the collateral, we're not taking collaterals in order to force one to bring chatas. So Rav Lichtenstein learns from here that that chatas is not a punishment. Yeah, chatas is not it's just a consequence. But as we'll see, it really has to do with the machlokas that we already mentioned, the two ways to look at chatas. Yeah, whether I see you as, because of your negligence, it's your fault, and therefore you have to bring, okay, or not. At any rate, if I assume that chatas is just a consequence and not a punishment, then we'll be dependent here as how I understand the conclusion of the Gemarah. Yeah? The conclusion, if the conclusion says that onus is a p'tur only from punishments, and monetary compensation is a punishment, but from consequences there's no p'tur of onus, just like the Havamina claimed, then of course it's the shita of Chachamim in our sugya, that one has to bring chatas. Okay? And it's a shogeg. But if I say that onus is actually not only exempting from punishment, but also defined as making the person not responsible for his actions, and even for the consequence, that's the shita of Rabbi Yehuda in our sugya, that he is exempt from individual chatas when he followed the ruling of the Sanhedrin. Let's continue. Shabbat Samachet. Ketzah. Tinok shenishba lebein anochrim. I'm very happy we're learning this, because those of you who have a sharp memory, remember that a year ago, we learned this, or 2 years ago, I don't remember. We learned Masechet Shabbos, this chapter. Tinok shenishba lebein anochrim. V'ger shenitgayer bein anochrim. V'asa melachos arbe b'shabbatos arbe, ino chayav ela chatas achat. Okay, we have a case where someone inadvertently violated Shabbos, did melachos, many melachos, in many Shabbosos, and yet still he brings only one offering for the entire 1,000 violations that he did. That's the first case of the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbos in the 7th chapter of Shabbos. Why? How do we understand? What is the case? The Gemarah explains. Tinok shenishba lebein anochrim. It's a person who doesn't know that there is a Shabbos at all. So it's really one mistake. He never knew, or he doesn't know that there is a Shabbos. Because he is grown up. This is a Jew that for some circumstances, a little kid that grew up among Gentiles and didn't have any Jewish education. So he really didn't know that there is a Shabbos. Or, and that's a provocative case, a convert that even though he converted, he doesn't know what is Shabbos. Now you'll all ask me, how is that possible that a convert, part of the conditions is that he learns halachos? Great questions. Indeed, some of the Achronim were medayik from this Mishnah, that B'diavad, someone who converts and just says he's a Jew, he is a convert, B'diavad. The big discussion. I'm just putting that in parentheses now. So such a person who never knew what is Shabbos, he is bringing only one sin offering. On each avera, he's bringing only one, even if he did them 1,000 times. Umunbaz poter. Look at that. It's a machlokas tanaim about the tinok shenishba. Whereas Tanakama defines him as a shogeg. Munbaz says that he is exempt from bringing chatas. Why? What's the svara of Munbaz? It seems that Munbaz holds that he is an anus. The guy was never taught what is Shabbos. What do you want from him? Why are you considering him shogeg to bring a sin offering? Munbaz says he doesn't have to bring even one. The ton of the Mishnah, the Gemara explains, is Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva holds that he is a shogeg. Some Achronim want to claim, Rav Lichtenstein also, that actually perhaps the machloket of our Tanaim, whether one that followed the false ruling of Beidin, of Sanhedrin, whether he is a shogeg or he is an anus, is exactly the same machlokas of Rabbi Akiva and Munbaz, right? Rabbi Yehuda holds like Munbaz, that he's an anus, even though it's a mistake in the halacha, not in the reality. I remind you, in the Rambam, the mistake was in the reality. Reality happened that was beyond his control. Here the machloket is a human being's machloket in halacha. So I could say, I did the action. I am not an anus. It's a mistake. I need to bring shogeg, chatas. That's the opinion of Chachamim in our sugya and the opinion of Rabbi Akiva here. However, Munbaz and Rabbi Yehuda in our sugya holds it's an anus. Okay? Now, I want to explain another thing. Could there be a distinction between a case of basing myself on a ruling of Beidin and a tinok shenishba? Of course, there is a common denominator. The common denominator is that it was beyond my control in the sense that I followed or I rely on Beidin, and it makes sense that I'll rely on Beidin. Perhaps I'm even obligated. That's the common denominator. And yet still, a tinok shenishba and a ger shenitgayer, that is an extreme case of anus. He was never exposed to Yiddishkeit. Okay, so perhaps even Munbaz that says here that he's an anus will concede in our case that he's a shogeg, though the pashtus, it's the same thing. Now, okay. So the action was done out of free will, but it was related on Beidin, and he couldn't know that it's usher, and the same thing regarding Munbaz. By the way, the Rambam is, on the one hand, posek in Hilchos Shogegos, as we've seen, that when there is a reality, unknown thing that is beyond your control, you're an anus. However, here he is posek like Rabbi Akiva against Munbaz, and also like Hakamim that he brings chatas against Rabbi Yehuda. Now, let's see the chiyuv of this kind of shogeg / anus that we explained that it has to do as to understanding of the chatas. Let's see the Ramban in Vayikra. Ve'ani tameh. I need to explain you this Ramban in Vayikra. This Ramban in Vayikra talks about the case of shogeg. He talks about korban ola. Okay, Ola, what does it says in Ola? Mamash, the fourth pasuk in Sefer Vayikra, Parshas Ola. Ola is a full offering, a wholesome offering, right? Ola is not an obligatory korban. Ola. I'm not talking about korban tzibur, tamid shel shachar, tamid shel ben arbaim. I'm talking about an individual Ola, meaning chatas is a mandatory one. right? Chatas, if I violated inadvertently, if I inadvertently violated Shabbos, I'm obligated to bring chatas. Ola, it's not obligatory. So when does a person bring an ola? Furthermore, it says in the ola, in the fourth pasuk in Sefer Vayikra, it said, "V'samach yado al rosh ola, v'nirtza lo lechaper alav." He's putting his hand on the ola, and then it appeases on him and makes atonement on him. Hello, why atonement? What wrong did this guy do? Why? What kind of atonement is korban ola? The Ramban, not the Ramban, it's a question on the Pshat, okay? Rashi, based on the sages, is saying that the appeasement and the atonement of the Ola is on a failure to do a mitzvah aseh, okay? Whereas Chatas, as we said, you're obligated to bring the Korban Chatat for atonement if you inadvertently violated a lotaseh, not only a lotaseh, a severe lotaseh. Lotaseh is that is in degree of karet. Only if you do such a thing, you bring a chatas. What if you fail to do something much less strict, severe? The only thing is that you had a mitzvah aseh to do, and you were lazy from doing it. You failed doing a mitzvah aseh, then your atonement is via ola. The Ramban has a problem understanding this midrash, and let's read the Ramban. Vanita mea, see? And he's questioning Rashi and the midrash, that the ola is brought, the kapara of the ola is for a failure of doing mitzvahs aseh, a positive commandment. Vanita mea, v'chiechanon shanamu, כי הקורבנות בשוגגין הן מרצים, ונוכל לומר שיכפרו על חייבי מיתה בידי שמיים שוגגין, ועל חייבי מלכות שוגגין, ועל חייבי מיתות בית דין שוגגין, באותן שאין חייבים עליהם חטאת, כגון מכה אביבי אמו ומקלל, כשם שהחטאת מכוונת בחייבי מיתות שוגגין. Ramban says, look, there is a jump here. Why did you jump to the ola? Where do we see any punishment? Even in a mazid, even when a person in a mazid fails to do a positive commandment, since it's not a negative commandment, we don't see a punishment. So why ola as a kapara here? And you jump the category. You have so many tons of negative commandments that one doesn't bring chatas on. You have so many negative commandments that if one transgresses inadvertently, he doesn't bring chatas because it's not chiyuv kares, like one who is cursing, one who is hitting his parents. So for that, let the ola be the ritzui and the kapara for this. The Rabbanan says, "V'lakach ra'u she'ein b'chayvei mita b'dei shamayim u'chayvei malkot." Someone that the punishment is not karet, but rather only lashes. Elo unshana mefurash ben b'mezid. Aval b'shogeg ein alem shum nesiut chet ve'ein tzrichin ritzui klal. Wow, you think I'll tell you the answer? And it's an amazing answer of the Ramban. Conceptually, very important. He says, look, in all the averos that there are lashes, the only thing that is explicit is what? Is the mazid, the lashes. Shogeg, you're not considered a sinner. It was inadvertent. Therefore, you don't need atonement. Okay, we need to ask, so why do you need atonement for the karet, inadvertent? Because the Ramban here is saying a radical thing, saying even negative commandments, even the ones that the punishment is lashes, you are tachlis, not considered a sinner if you did it inadvertently, and therefore you don't need atonement for it. Ve'itachen lomar, says Ramban, he explains, ki ba'avur shelo izkir b'korbanot hanedava, lechaper al shegigato asher shagag, asher b'korbanot achet, ve'amar v'nirtza, היה לרבותינו במשמעות הזה שיכפר על המזידים שאינם רצויים לפניו. So he says, I'll tell you, the Ola, I'll explain you Rashi. The Ola is brought for someone who failed to do a positive commandment intentionally. That's Benirza. This is kapara on the mezid. And they're, of course, not retzuyim, not desired by him. And that's why you bring the Ola. Ki ha-shogeg, here's the important sentence. Af al pi shechata, he made a sin. It wasn't anus. It wasn't anus. The personality, he chose to do a wrong action. But since it was totally inadvertent, af al pi shechata, since it was inadvertently, ratzuy hashemu, you don't need to do an appeasement. You are already desired. So therefore, you don't need to bring Ola, even if you did a negative commandment inadvertently, you don't need to bring Ola. When do you need to bring Ola? Only when you did something in Mezid. Then there will be Avaritzui. Then you'll have a Ritzu. Of course, you can bring Ola stam as an Adava. In Ken Efshar lo lechaper la mizadim, zulati alaseh. Look at this wonderful solution. Ramban is brilliant here. So Ola could be only on a positive commandment. He defends the sages. Why? Because on a negative commandment, intentionally, transgressing it intentionally, you have already a punishment, lashes. That's your kapara. So what is the only thing that is left that doesn't have a punishment, but one did it in Mezid, and therefore he needs a ritzui, a kapara, an atonement on it, when he failed intentionally to do a positive commandment. That's the case of Ola. So in so you're not getting punished for failing from doing a positive commandment, but you're not desired. So how will I appease my master? That present of Ola. What do we see in this very, very important Ramban? We see here clearly the Ramban says that ha-shogeg ratzui Hashemu. That was the sentence that Ramban said. Ramban insists that someone who did a sin inadvertently doesn't need kapara, does not need ritzui, does not need kapara. Someone who did a sin inadvertently. So now the son asks, okay, Ramban, brilliant. How do you explain the fact that one who did a kares inadvertently, how do you explain that he has to bring chatas and has ritzui? Of course, Ramban had an answer for that. We have two options to answer. Nachon? You know what? Before I say, I'll leave the public here to answer. Okay? Now, okay? I'm asking the question according to Ramban. We're almost done with the shir, okay? I want to lay this question in front of you all. Ramban says that one who does a sin inadvertently, Ratzui Hashemu. Yeah, he's already desired by Hashem. It was a mistake. Therefore, he doesn't need to bring any atonement. But Ramban admits that one who sinned inadvertently in a Avera of Kares, he does have to bring a sin offering for Ritzui. So why is that? Why according to Ramban, one has to bring Chatas at all, if one who does actions b'shgaga is still Ratzui Hashem? Of course, the Ramban had an answer to this question. So The question is understood? If Ramban explained that Korban Ola that says Ritzu in atonement must refer to something that was done b'mezid, because b'shogeg, no one needs to bring atonement. And he says that loud and clear. Okay? So why is there still a din according to Ramban that when one sinned inadvertently in averos that are Hayav Mita Bidei Shammai or Kritus, he does have to bring the sin offering. No shomel.
Maybe it's because ביטול קורבן עשה.
לא. ביטול קורבן עשה, אמרנו כבר. ביטול קורבן עשה, אדם מביא עולה אם הוא עשה את זה במזיד. אם הוא עשה את זה בשוגג, אז הוא לא מביא כלום. זה הרמב"ם. חטאת is for sinning inadvertently, transgressing inadvertently, a negative commandment that one b'mezid will be chayav karas on. Okay? If the shogeg is Ratzui Hashem, why is he bringing chatas? So, Hebron, because of the time, we have two options here according to Ramban. Gabe, you wanted to say something?
Well, is it something like one is Bidei Shamayim and the other is normal human?
No, you're right. But still the question is, if the Ramban tells us, Hashogeg Ratzui Hashem, okay, and argues that powerfully, that someone who does b'shogeg doesn't need atonement. So why does he need atonement if it's an inadvertent shogeg in averos that when it's done b'mezid, you're chayav kares? The answer is one of two. Either I say that these are such severe averos, okay, all right, such severe averos that here a person should be extra careful in these ones. And since he needs to be extra careful because it's a kares averos, okay, therefore here and only here, Ramban will say the shogeg has some responsibility. He's a little ashem. He should have been more careful. And that's why he needs to bring atonement. That's one option. The Ramban said generally shogeg in all the negative commandments and positive commands, he is Ratzui Hashem. I don't consider him as someone as fault. He doesn't need to bring atonement. But here, because of the severity of these averas, he should have been more careful. That's one option. The other option in the Ramban, which even seems more plausible in the Ramban, is no, that his idea that Shogeg Ratzui Hashem, that there is no fault, is indeed, he says it everywhere. Only these averas are so severe, as Gabe said, it's a kares if you're doing it b'mezid. You're cut from Am Yisrael, from the world to come, from everything, okay? There's such severe averos, these averos, that even if you did it inadvertently, in these averos, because of the chumrah of the averos, it's not that it's your fault. It's not your fault, just like it wasn't your fault in other negative commandments. But you need the metaphysical damage is so hard, and you're still the agent who did the action. Therefore, since you caused that metaphysical damage to yourself and to the entire world, you need to bring korban chatas. As you could see, these two explanations are the difference between what we'll say chet and avil, a fault or just a sin. A fault is if you're responsible. So our first understanding tried to say, every shogeg, we don't see him as responsible. There's no avil here, it's not his fault. And in karet, it is his fault, because he should have been more careful. The second understanding was that, no, it's not his fault. We're not talking about faults here. Only in these karet averos, the metaphysical damage died by the agent, and since he wasn't coerced by a gun, it's still an action. So he did a mistake, and he wasn't even responsible for that mistake, but still he did the mistake. It's the eye that did the mistake. So he needs, in the case of karet, you need to bring atonement and a chatas for it. As you can see, these two understandings are exactly corresponding to what? To Machloket Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim. In our case, it was beyond his control. He followed Sanhedrin. However, the metaphysical damage is done, so he needs to bring chatas. Or, according to our first explanation, Ramban, that in kares, you need to be more careful, etc. Meaning we're still in the discourse of fault. Here, we'll conclude with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that he's patur. Okay, we're finishing the shir. Now let's zoom and see everything inside. Okay, just regarding this Ramban, I didn't bring it here, okay? Regarding this Ramban, there is a rabbi called Rabbi Meir Arik. He says, it's a big chiddush what he says, that b'shogeg there is no nesiut chet, ein nesiut chet, and in shogeg ein nesiut chet, there's no, he's considered Ratzui Hashem. Rambam Hilchos Shuva is claiming that all the shogegim need kapara. Meaning Reb Meir Arik says, no, what do you mean? You need kapara. Every shogeg. Okay, it could be that they're deferring this. Now let's see the Ramban in Sha'ar HaGmul and see how the two understandings that we said in the Ramban. We explain according to Ramban why one brings chatas when he's doing a negative transgression that is in the level of kares, in Mazid. Why is it bringing the offering even though he did it inadvertently? According to Ramban, after all, the Ramban says that shogeg doesn't need kapara generally. We said either the severity of the case caused you to, you should have been more careful. You're bringing the chatas because of your fault. Or no, not because of your fault, because of the metaphysical damage in such severe transgressions, even though it's not your fault. And we said that's a machloket Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim in our sugya. Now let's see Ramban in Sha'ar HaGmul. ולמה נקראו ייסורים של העבר? והלא ייסורים afflictions, ייסורים, sufferings, affliction, sufferings. Why are they called sufferings of ahava when Hashem is making you suffer? והלא ייסורים שפרשו ייסורים של עונשים הם. Ramban in Sha'ar HaGmul talks about someone that is, let's say, suffering. So he says, if the sufferings are punishments for his little averos that he did in order to have a good portion in the world to come, so he gets yisurin in this world, so it's not a yisurin of love, it's yisurin of punishment. Let's say it's brought for doing doing sins inadvertently. Why is he a sinner? I remind you that Ramban explained to us that someone who does actions inadvertently is not a sinner. So now here the Ramban solves our problem. Here, clearly the Ramban goes with the first option, of fault. He wasn't careful enough. He wasn't in full awe not to go over the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. שלא יאכל ולא יעשה דבר עד שיבדוק יפה יפה, ויתגלה לו הדבר שהוא מותר, ראוי לו לפי גזרותיו של הקדוש ברוך הוא, ועל הדרך הזו הוא טעם חטא השגגה בכל התורה. So here the Ramban goes with our first explanation. Probably the Ramban says, if you want to reconcile the sources, that only in big averos like karet, one is expected to check very, very carefully. In others, he's not considered a sinner. Ve'od, now he says a second thing. שכל דבר האסור מלכלך הנפש ומטמא אותה. דכתיב וניטמתם בה. Everything that is asur, even if you did it inadvertently, it is making your soul dirty and it contaminates it. לפיכך נקרא השוגג חוטא. Therefore, the shogeg is called a sinner. אף על פי כן אין השוגג ראוי להיענש על שגיגתו בגיהנום ובהרשחת. אלו שצריך מירוק מאותו עוון, he just needs to be clean from that sin. and to be sanctified and purified from him, so he will have the good portion in the Olam Haba for his good deeds. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu had mercy on his people, and he gave them the korbanos for the kapara on Shogeg. Clearly the Ramban here, look how nicely it is, says our two understandings. Nachon? Look how nice it is. The Ramban gives two explanations why the Shogeg is considered a sinner. The first one is an explanation in the discourse of fault. He did a wrong moral action. He should have been careful and he wasn't. He's morally responsible. The second explanation says, no, he's not morally responsible. It's not that he was a sinner in that sense. He was a sinner in the sense that he did an action, even though it was inadvertent, that just he needs now atonement to be cleaned from it because it caused the metaphysical damage. And that's why he has the chatas to clean it. And the chiluk between this negative and said that only in these negative commandments of the kares, only there you need this korban in order to clean yourself. But in others, the metaphysical damage is not so much, and therefore there is no chiyuv chatas. These two understandings of the Ramban, whether chatas in shogeg, in averos of kares, whether chatas is shogeg is because of fault, or not because of fault, it's just because it's adavar asur melachlecha nefesh umetameota. These two understandings of the Ramban clearly correspond to machloket Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim, whether one who followed a wrong ruling of Sanhedrin, whether he's considered Anus, like Rabbi Yehuda, and he's exempt. This is understood if I put the focus on fault. It's not his fault. He followed the Beidin. Therefore, you can't say lo nizar be'atzmo, lo hayaya. He was nizar. And the second understanding is to say, like Chachamim, no, it's not a question of carefulness. It's a question of just, okay, he was careful. He followed the Beidin, but still he did a sin that made his soul dirty. Therefore, he needs to bring atonement, individual chadas. He's not Anus here, he's a Shogeg. Okay, Chaverim. Next week we'll continue in the Gemara. Chodesh Tov v'Shabbat Shalom.
Chodesh Tov, Shabbat Shalom.